Mm. The roar of 50 Harley-Davidsons shook the diner's windows like an earthquake. Everyone froze, terrified. But when the dust settled, the biggest, meanest Hell's Angel didn't pull a weapon. He stared at a trembling 14-year-old boy and growled. He refused my money. What happened next defied everything we know. The Mojave Desert in August is less of a location and more of an anvil. The heat beats down relentlessly, turning the asphalt of Route 95 into a shimmering, mirage-soaked ribbon that leads to nowhere. In the summer of 1998, nowhere was exactly where 14-year-old Henry Thompson found himself. Henry worked at the Rust Dust Diner, a decaying roadside stop with flickering neon signs and a cracked linoleum floor that permanently smelled of burnt coffee and old grease. He wasn't supposed to be working there. Child labor laws were a thing, even in Nevada, but the diner's owner, Arthur Pendleton, liked cheap labor that couldn't complain to the authorities. Arthur paid Henry $3.50 an hour, strictly under the table. For Henry, every single penny was a lifeline. His mother, Sarah, was tethered to an oxygen tank in their sweltering single-wide trailer 3 miles down the road. Severe chronic obstructive pulmonary disease had stolen her breath, her job, and their savings. The bank had sent their final warning: if they didn't come up with $840 by the end of the month, the trailer would be repossessed. Henry was a boy carrying the weight of a grown man's world on shoulders that were still too narrow to bear it. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of dead, stifling day where the air conditioning had surrendered completely. Henry was behind the counter, scraping a stubborn patch of dried ketchup off a vinyl booth when the vibration started. It didn't begin as a sound. It began as a tremor in the soles of Henry's worn-out Converse sneakers. The coffee in the glass pots on the burners began to ripple. Then came the sound of deep, guttural thunder that swallowed the desert wind. Arthur, who had been lazily counting the register till, slammed the drawer shut and retreated toward the kitchen doors, his face draining of color. The few patrons in the diner, a trucker eating pie, an elderly couple looking over a map, shrank down into their booths, trying to make themselves invisible. Through the grease-stained front window, a massive column of motorcycles materialized from the heat haze. They were riding in a tight, disciplined formation, the sun catching the chrome of modified exhaust pipes and the polished paint of heavy V-twin engines. There were at least 50 of them. As they angled their heavy bikes into the diner's dusty parking lot, kicking up a massive cloud of alkaline dirt, the patches on their leather cuts became visible. The winged death's head, the red and white lettering, the Hell's Angels. They killed their engines almost simultaneously, but the silence that followed was heavier and more intimidating than the roar had been. Heavy boots crunched against the gravel. The diner door chimed a weak, pathetic little bell that seemed entirely inadequate for the men stepping through the threshold. Leading the pack was a man who looked like he had been carved out of a granite mountain and left out in the weather to harden. His name, printed on a small leather strip on his chest, was Big Jim Callahan. He was the sergeant-at-arms for the regional charter. A thick, jagged scar ran down the side of his neck, disappearing beneath the collar of his faded t-shirt. His arms were heavy with ink, the muscles corded and tense. Big Jim didn't look around. He didn't need to. He commanded the space simply by existing in it. He walked straight to the counter and sat on a vinyl stool that groaned under his immense weight. 5 of his brothers flanked him, while the rest fanned out outside, leaning against their bikes, smoking, and keeping a perimeter. Boy, Big Jim's voice was like gravel churning in a cement mixer. Black coffee. The whole pot. And whatever the biggest steak you got is, burn it on the grill and bring it here. Arthur was cowering in the kitchen, peering through the circular window of the swinging door. He aggressively shooed Henry forward with a frantic wave of his hand. Henry's hands were shaking so badly, he nearly dropped the heavy glass pot as he poured the pitch-black coffee into a thick ceramic mug. He didn't look away, though. His late father, Thomas, had taught him one unbreakable rule before he passed away from a sudden heart attack 3 years prior. Never look at your shoes when a man is talking to you. Fear is a choice, respect is a currency. Yes, sir, Henry said, his voice cracking slightly, betraying his age. He set the mug down gently, making sure not to spill a drop. Jim Callahan paused, his hand halfway to the mug, and slowly raised his eyes to meet the boy's. He saw the frayed collar of Henry's shirt, the dark circles under his young eyes, and the desperate thin frame. Jim didn't say a word. He just grunted and took a sip of the scalding coffee as if it were ice water. 30 agonizing minutes passed. The diner remained completely silent except for the clatter of silverware. When Jim finished his meal, he reached into the deep pocket of his leather cut. He pulled out a crumpled, greasy $100 bill and tossed it onto the counter. The meal was $12. Keep the change, kid, Jim rumbled, standing up. As Jim turned to leave, his heavy leather cut caught on the edge of the metal counter. The movement shifted the contents of his deep inner pocket. A thick, heavy object slipped out, falling silently onto the dark floor mat behind the stool. The bikers marched out, the door chiming its weak farewell. Henry walked around the counter to clear the plates. That was when he saw it. Lying in the shadows of the floor mat was a roll of cash thicker than Henry's wrist. It was held together by 2 heavy-duty rubber bands. The bill on the outside was 100. Henry could see the green edges of dozens more packed tightly beneath it. There had to be $5, maybe $10,000 sitting right there on the dirty linoleum. For a span of 3 heartbeats, time completely stopped for Henry. He stared at the brick of money. $840. That was all he needed to save the trailer. That was all he needed to buy his mother the medical-grade nebulizer she desperately required. The money lying on the floor could solve every single problem in Henry's life and leave enough left over to feed them for a year. "What's that?" Arthur's sharp, reedy voice shattered the silence. The diner owner had crept out of the kitchen the moment the bikers left the building. His greedy eyes locked onto the floor. "Lord have mercy," Arthur whispered, taking a rapid step forward, his hand reaching out like a claw. "They dropped their bank. Pick that up, boy. Hand it to me. They owe me for terrorizing my customers." Something inside Henry snapped. He knew Arthur. He knew that if Arthur got his hands on that money, it would vanish into his private safe, and Henry would still be working for pennies while his mother suffocated in a sweltering metal box. But more importantly, Henry knew whose money it was. You didn't steal from the Hells Angels. That wasn't just illegal, it was suicidal. Before Arthur could reach it, Henry dropped to his knees, snatched the heavy roll of cash, and shoved it deep into the pocket of his faded jeans. "Hey," Arthur barked, his face flushing dark red. "Give me that right now, you little thief." "I'm your boss. It's not yours," Henry shot back, his voice surprisingly steady. He backed away from the counter, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Outside, the first few engines began to roar to life, a deafening mechanical symphony. The bikers were leaving. "Henry, if you walk out that door, you are fired. You hear me? Don't you ever come back," Arthur screamed, spit flying from his lips. Henry didn't hesitate. He burst through the diner doors into the blinding Nevada sun. The heat hit him like a physical blow, mixed with the overpowering stench of high-octane gasoline and exhaust. The convoy was already moving, pulling out onto the shoulder of Route 95. Big Jim Callahan was at the front, his massive boots resting on the highway pegs of his custom knucklehead, revving the throttle. "Wait! Hey! Wait!" Henry screamed, his young voice entirely drowned out by the thunder of 50 V-twins. He ran. He sprinted across the gravel, his thin legs pumping, waving his arms frantically. He threw himself into the dust kicked up by the rear tires, coughing, his eyes watering. At the back of the pack, A rider named Snake Henderson caught sight of the boy in his rearview mirror. Frowning, Snake laid on his extremely loud, customized air horn. The piercing sound cut through the engine noise. Big Jim glanced back, saw Snake pointing at the diner, and then saw the kid running through the exhaust fumes. Jim raised a massive gloved fist. Instantly, the entire convoy slowed, geared down, and rumbled to a halt on the shoulder of the highway. Henry ran up to the front, completely out of breath, his chest heaving. He was terrified. 50 hardened men in leather cuts were staring down at him, their expressions ranging from annoyed to deeply suspicious. Jim kicked his kickstand down and leaned the heavy bike over. He didn't take off his sunglasses. "What is it, kid? You didn't like the tip." Henry coughed, reaching into his pocket. His hands were trembling so violently he could barely grip the roll. He pulled out the brick of cash and held it out, his arm extended toward the giant man. You dropped this," Henry gasped, trying to catch his breath. "It fell out of your jacket when you stood up." Complete silence fell over the immediate group. Snake Henderson leaned over his handlebars, his eyes widening behind his goggles. Ryder Pete, another massive man flanking Jim, let out a low, slow whistle. Jim looked at the money, then reached into his inner pocket. His jaw tightened when he felt nothing but empty air. He reached out and took the roll from the boy's trembling hand. Jim weighed it in his palm, his face an unreadable mask of stone. "Do you know how much money this is, boy?" Jim asked quietly. "No, sir. I didn't count it. It's $12,000, Jim said, his voice carrying clearly over the idling engines. "Our charters run money." Henry just nodded, swallowing hard. Jim stared at the kid. He looked at the boy's worn-out shoes, the cheap, threadbare clothes, and the obvious desperation radiating from him. Jim knew poverty when he saw it. He had grown up in it. Slowly, Jim peeled back the rubber band. He separated $500 bills from the stack and held them out toward Henry. "You got guts, kid, or you're just stupid. Either way, you did the club a solid. Take it. It's yours." Henry looked at the 5 crisp $100 bills. $500. It was more than half of what he needed for the bank. It would change his immediate reality. His hand twitched. He wanted to take it so badly it physically ached. But then he remembered the night before his father died. His dad had found a wallet in a parking lot with $800 in it. They were broke then, too, but his dad had driven across town to return it to its owner, refusing a reward. "Thomas men don't take charity," his father had said, tapping Henry's chest. "And dirty money washes away clean sleep. We earn what we have, Henry. Otherwise, the money owns you." Henry looked up into the dark lenses of Big Jim's sunglasses. He slowly pushed Jim's massive hand away. "I can't take that, sir," Henry said, his voice barely a whisper, but firm. Jim's brow furrowed. "Are you out of your mind? I'm giving it to you. Take the damn money." "No, sir," Henry repeated, stepping back. My dad told me that money you don't earn is money that owns you. I didn't earn that. I just picked it up off the floor." A strange ripple of tension passed through the surrounding bikers. Nobody refused money from Big Jim Callahan. It could be seen as an insult. Jim took off his sunglasses. His eyes were a pale, icy blue surrounded by crags of weathered skin. He studied Henry with an intensity that made the boy want to run away. "Your dad told you that, huh?" Jim asked softly. "What's your name, kid?" "Henry." "Henry Thompson." Jim froze. It was a microscopic movement, a sudden stiffening of his massive shoulders. But Snake and Pete noticed it instantly. Jim's icy blue eyes widened just a fraction. "Your old man, his name wouldn't happen to be Thomas, would it?" "Tommy Thompson ran a wrench shop out in Barstow about 10 years ago?" Henry blinked in shock. "Yes, sir. He was a mechanic. He passed away 3 years ago." Jim Callahan stared at the dirt for a long, heavy moment. He slowly folded the $500 back into the roll, snapped the rubber band around it, and shoved it deep into his vest. He didn't say another word. He put his sunglasses back on, gripped the clutch, and kicked his bike into gear. "Let's ride," Jim barked. The engines roared, kicking up a furious cloud of dust. Without a backward glance, the Hells Angels pulled away, leaving Henry standing alone on the shoulder of the highway, choking on exhaust fumes. When Henry walked back into the diner, Arthur was waiting. "You gave it back?" Arthur shrieked, his face twisted in disbelief and rage. "You stupid, worthless little punk. You could have brought that to me. You're fired. Get out of my diner. And don't bother asking for your last week's pay, because you just cost me a fortune." Henry walked the 3 miles home in the blistering heat. When he opened the door to the trailer, the sound of his mother's struggling, rattling breath greeted him. The next 2 weeks were a rapid descent into hell. Without Henry's meager income, they couldn't even afford groceries, relying on canned beans from a local church pantry. The end of the month arrived, cold and indifferent. Mr. Gable, the ruthless property manager of the trailer park, penned the bright pink eviction notice to their cheap aluminum door on a Tuesday morning. They had 48 hours to vacate. Henry sat on the cinder block steps at the trailer, his head in his hands, tears of utter defeat finally leaking from his eyes. He had tried so hard, he had done the right thing, and it had cost him everything. He was just about to go inside and tell his mother the terrible news when he felt it. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a vibration in the soles of his worn-out Converse sneakers. The empty tin cans in the recycling bin began to rattle. Henry stood up, wiping his eyes, looking toward the dusty road that led into the trailer park. Through the shimmering heat haze, a massive column of motorcycles was materializing. The Hells Angels had returned. And this time they were coming straight for him. The Shady Pines trailer park was neither shady, nor did it have pines. It was a barren grid of baking aluminum boxes, rusted swing sets, and stray dogs. It was a place where people went when they had run out of everywhere else to go. But on this particular Tuesday afternoon, it became the center of the universe. The roar grew deafening, rattling the cheap windows of Henry's trailer so violently he thought the glass would shatter. The stray dogs scattered, barking in absolute panic, as the first wave of heavy, chrome-laden Harley-Davidsons turned off the county road and roared through the park's entrance. They didn't just park, they occupied the space. 50 members of the Hells Angels fanned out, their bikes creating a perfectly organized, impenetrable perimeter around Henry's dilapidated single-wide. Dust billowed up into the desert sky, casting an apocalyptic orange hue over the sun. Neighbors who had been sitting on their porches hastily retreated indoors, locking their deadbolts and peering wide-eyed through bent Venetian blinds. Henry stood frozen on his cinder block steps. In his left hand, he held the pink eviction notice. In his chest, his heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He thought they had come to punish him. He thought Arthur had somehow twisted the story, or that he had somehow disrespected their club by refusing the money. The engines died in a cascading wave of mechanical groans. The silence that followed was thick and terrifying. Big, Jim Callahan swung his massive leather-clad leg over his knucklehead. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely resolute. He unclipped a heavy, leather saddlebag from the rear of his bike and slung it over his broad shoulder. Flanked by Snake Henderson and Ryder Pete, Jim walked deliberately up the cracked concrete path toward Henry. "Boy," Jim said, his gravelly voice cutting through the ringing silence. He stopped at the bottom of the cinder block steps, looking up at the terrified teenager. "I didn't take it," Henry blurted out, his voice trembling, holding up his empty hands. "I swear, Mr. Callahan. I left it all with you. I didn't take a dime." Jim held up a massive, calloused hand, instantly silencing the boy. He took off his dark sunglasses, revealing those piercing, icy blue eyes. I know you didn't, Henry. That's why we're here. Jim sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to carry years of hard miles. He sat down on a rusted metal lawn chair in Henry's small dirt yard. The chair groaned in protest. He gestured for Henry to sit on the steps. 2 weeks ago, on that highway, Jim began, his voice low enough that only Henry and the two angels beside him could hear. You said something to me. You said, money you don't earn is money that owns you. And you told me your daddy was Tommy Thompson from Barstow. Henry swallowed hard and nodded. Yes, sir. Let me tell you a story about Tommy Thompson, Jim said, leaning forward, resting his thick forearms on his knees. The year was 1988. I wasn't an officer in this club back then. I was a young, reckless prospect, with more attitude than brains. I got into a bad scrape down near the border with a rival syndicate. It went south, fast. They put a bullet in my shoulder and chased me halfway across the Mojave. Snake Henderson crossed his arms, his face grim as he remembered the era. My bike was leaking oil and I was leaking blood, Jim continued, staring at the dust between his heavy boots. I rolled into Barstow in the dead of night, looking for a place to die. I crashed my bike into a chain-link fence behind an independent mechanic's shop. The owner lived in a small attachment in the back. He came out with a 12-gauge shotgun ready to blow my head off. Jim looked up, locking eyes with Henry. That was your old man, Tommy. He saw my colors. He knew exactly what I was, and he knew the kind of trouble that was hunting me. He had every reason to call the cops or shoot me where I stood. But he saw a 22-year-old kid bleeding to death in his dirt. Henry's breath hitched. He had never heard this story. His father had never spoken a word of it. Tommy dragged me inside, Jim said, his voice softening with reverence. He threw a tarp over my leaking bike. 30 minutes later, 2 trucks full of heavily armed men rolled up to his gate. They were looking for blood. Your daddy walked out there, stood under the floodlights with that shotgun resting on his hip, and looked those killers dead in the eye. He told them he was a veteran. He was heavily armed, and if they stepped foot on his property, they wouldn't be leaving it. A profound silence settled over the yard, broken only by the distant rattling hum of Sarah's oxygen concentrator inside the trailer. They bought it, Jim whispered. They drove off. Tommy spent the next 3 days digging the bullet out of my shoulder, packing the wound, and rebuilding my engine block. When I was finally strong enough to ride, I pulled out a roll of dirty money to pay him. It was syndicate money, stolen. Jim reached into his cut and pulled out a cigar, not lighting it, just rolling it between his fingers. Your old man looked at that money, looked at me, and said, Thomas, men don't take charity. And dirty money washes away clean sleep. Keep your blood money, son. Just ride straight. Tears welled up in Henry's eyes. Hearing his father's exact words coming from the mouth of this hardened outlaw was like hearing a ghost speak. I owe Tommy Thompson my life, Jim stated, his tone absolute. And a Hell's Angel never ever forgets a debt. We tried to find him years later to pay him back, but he had closed the shop and moved. The trail went cold. Until a scrawny 14-year-old kid ran into highway traffic to hand me back 12 grand because of his daddy's code. Jim unbuckled the leather saddlebag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. You refused my money on the highway, Henry. Because it was charity. Because it was dirty. You were right. Your old man raised a good boy. Jim stood up, his massive frame towering over the yard. But this right here, this isn't charity. Jim tossed a heavy manila envelope onto Henry's lap. Open it. With trembling fingers, Henry broke the seal. Inside sat a stack of official cashier's checks. The top one, made out to the estate of Thomas Thompson, was for $25,000. What is this? Henry gasped, his mind reeling. Legitimate repayment of a mechanic's lien, plus 10 years of compound interest, drawn from the club's legal businesses. Jim said, a proud smile touching his scarred mouth. It's clean earned money. The bill your daddy never sent me. It belongs to you and your mother. Before Henry could process the miracle, tires screeched. Mr. Gable, the park's red-faced property manager, slammed his golf cart into park and stomped toward the yard, waving a clipboard. "Thompson, you are evicted," Gable screamed, completely oblivious to his surroundings. "I'm calling the sheriff to clear out these vagrants," Snake chuckled. Pete cracked his heavy knuckles. But Jim just turned, his massive frame radiating lethal calm, and walked until he was inches from the sweating manager. He effortlessly plucked the clipboard from Gable's hands. He owes back rent," Gable stammered, finally registering the 50 dust head patches surrounding him. "Not anymore," Jim rumbled. He pulled a wad of cash from his pocket, slapped $1,200 bills against Gable's chest, and leaned in close. "That covers back rent and 2 years in advance. If this boy's power gets cut, or if you so much as look at him sideways, I will come back here. And I won't bring my checkbook. Understand?" Gable nodded frantically, scrambled into his cart, and sped away in a terrified cloud of dust. Jim casually tore the pink eviction notice to shreds. Turning back to the steps, Jim nodded at Snake, who stepped forward and tossed a canvas bank bag onto Henry's lap. "Pete and I had a chat with your boss, Arthur, this morning." Snake grinned, his gold tooth flashing. "Gave him an intensive lesson in accounting and child labor laws. He suddenly found $3,000 in unpaid wages and severance." Henry stared at the fortune in his lap. Life-saving, clean money. His mother wouldn't suffocate in this oven anymore. They could afford the medical equipment, the food, the future. The crushing weight of the last 3 years shattered, and Henry buried his face in his hands, sobbing in profound relief. Jim placed a massive, grounding hand on the boy's shaking shoulder. "Look at me, Henry," Jim said softly. Henry wiped his eyes. "Your daddy saved my life. Today his honor saved yours," Jim said, his icy eyes shining. "You take care of your mama. And if anybody ever gives you trouble," Jim tapped the winged patch over his heart, "you tell them you have 50 uncles in Oakland who'd love to have a conversation about it." Jim squeezed Henry's shoulder, turned, and strode to his knucklehead. The engines whirred to life in a synchronized symphony of thunder. Without another word, the Hells Angels peeled out of the dirt lot, leaving nothing but swirling dust and a boy forever changed by a ghost from Barstow. Henry stood clutching the envelope to his chest, listening to the roar fade into the harsh Nevada desert. He looked up at the sweltering sun, smiled through his tears, and whispered, "Thanks, Dad. The world often tells us that honesty is a liability in a ruthless society." Yet Henry Thompson learned that true integrity casts a long shadow. His father's righteousness, planted a decade earlier, bloomed exactly when his family needed it most. The Hells Angels didn't return out of pity. They returned to honor an unbreakable code. Sometimes salvation doesn't wear a halo, sometimes it wears black leather and rides a roaring V-twin.